Ladies and gentlemen, once more you have arrived at this strange corner of the internet where called the Adventures in History Learned channel. And today is an All Things Wellington day. I am Josh, who, courtesy of a follower on YouTube, is now also being known as Lando. And this is Marcus. He's the co-host on this series.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm good, but then again, we already know that. We're both quite feeling the heat at the second because it's a very hot day.
I'm back up in the turret tonight, so it's rather stuffy up here, but see how we get on.
Mm-hmm. And today we're talking about Wellington's cavalry.
It's an exciting one. It's lightning attacks, with carbines, and dashing, daring do, and then some massive blunders, and it all goes a bit wrong.
Of course. Now we want to do some generalization sort of chat to begin with, as in, what's the deal with cavalry in this, era? What's its purpose? Why is it there? Your thoughts?
They kind of get broken down into two main schools, heavy and light, in theory, because the British don't have lancers at this time. We come up against them mostly at Waterloo and get them later. So we kind of got our light cavalry and our heavy cavalry. And the light cavalry made up mostly of like light dragoons and hussars, and heavy cavalry mostly made up of dragoon guards and the household cavalry like the life guards, and a few others. There are more, but that's broadly where they are. And in theory, the heavy cavalry have slightly larger horses, metal helmets, and a straight sword that they're going to be using as a lance. And again, in theory, they're going to be smashing into the enemy during a battle and even like trying to break squares and things like that. At the same time, the light cavalry are on smaller horses, using carbines, and actually are meant to be doing the scouting, the picket duties, the reconnaissance, as well as all sorts of important things like guarding routes, guarding prisoners. Now, most armies found that they just had such a shortage of horses, especially Wellington in the peninsula, that he uses cavalry interchangeably. Light and heavy, they're still designated as such, kind of goes out the window. So you have light cavalry in the heat of a battle going and doing like huge cavalry charges at the brigade level. So they have these designations. It mostly just means actually different kind of uniforms and different swords, which is something we're definitely going to come on to. But yeah, that's where they're mostly there. So they are the lightning strike in a battle, meant to be coming up, using the ground, hiding down low or behind some trees and getting infantry in the open and catching men and doing some really terrible damage. Or scouting, picket duties, guarding, actually guarding headquarters or prisoners or routes or carrying messages. But even today, speaking with multiple hats on, reconnaissance duty is not glamorous, is not well recorded, but is one of the most important things before any battle can take place, is you want to know the deployments and the designations of the enemy forces. And in a place like the Iberian Peninsula, where Wellington was for better part of a decade, it's a huge country, and he's got an army of somewhere between, depending on like the battle, 40 to 80 to 90,000 men, and the enemy have got probably one or two, actually not only like two armies trying to face him. He's hitting around one or the other. He wants to know where they are, where their route of advance is. Places are going to be using the old roads and fords and bridges because they've got artillery and they've got wagons, and finding where they're going, what their plans are, where their scouts are. And so there's lots of small, almost unrecorded actions where cavalry come up against cavalry and will have a skirmish and then fall back. So they are always very busy.
They are indeed. And on top of all of that, I mean, yeah, it's like cavalry has dominated warfare up to this point for centuries. The fastest thing on land is a horse. So that means the fastest your message can travel across ground is dependent on the fastest horse and the bravest and most talented rider. The fastest your army can go depends on the factors of how fast your advance cavalry can go, and how many horses you have to pull your guns. That's the highest and slowest
without the
speeds.
horses, they're moving wagons, they're moving all of your supplies as well.
And I mean, just on that note, very quickly, we are going. I think we should both give a nod to the other four-legged beasts that come that were part of armies. So you got oxen, especially in India, and mules and donkeys and things like that. They all played their part in getting an army from point A to point B. And it's an interesting dynamic to think about. That if you look at warfare in the pre-modern age or the early modern age, whether you have muskets and smoothbore weaponry, and even before that, when you just fight, hitting each other with rather nasty hand weapons. A lot of the stuff that happens on a battlefield and in a campaign happens the way it does because there are cavalry present. And so if you think about trying to move a regiment of infantry across, you want them to take a hill or a village or something like that, and there's a regiment of cavalry in front of the village. That means the infantry, theoretically, are in a vulnerable position, in a way. They have to be aware that they can be ridden down. So even if the cavalry cannot win a battle by themselves anymore, the days of the Mongols are kind of over. I'm saying that, but I'm just remembering that there are certain battles in India where mostly cavalry armies did actually win battles. But nevertheless, in Europe, certainly, cavalry were not all powerful, but they were the fastest and the most dangerous, maneuverable arm on the field. And
it's rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah,
it really is. But the cavalry if they fight an infantry unit in line, can do huge damage. It is, scissors through paper. However, as soon as the infantry form squares, with really one notable exception after Salamanca, which was mostly a fluke, and one I can think of in Russia, obviously, which doesn't concern Wellington, they suddenly become, this big stone rock that the scissors just can't get. And actually, in attacking them, they blunt themselves.
Yeah.
I'm thinking also like Ney's charge at Waterloo. So it's this rock, paper, scissors dynamic of if they catch the infantry by surprise, then they have a big upper hand. But without that, actually, they then become less effective.
Yeah.
And so it's these kind of trying to outplay each other, trying to move,
Exactly.
and also you bring in the artillery because then in square, all of a sudden they're being wrapped over. It's deadly warfare.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real thing of strategy and maneuver, like you say. And the infantry the cavalry play a huge part in choosing that ground because they'll be scouting it as well, as I was linking into earlier.
Often the first engagements of any major battle is done by cavalry, and in the cavalry, they call them vedettes rather than pickets. But it's these small skirmishes. If you're going to take ground, cavalry will probably get there first. And if they're not there first, and you just have a bunch of foot skirmishes up there, you want to get cavalry there as soon as possible to dissuade the enemy from building up the concentration there. That's just this is the dynamics that you're working with. The horse dominates a great deal of military thinking at this time. That's why they're still part of armies. People think of it.
And you're saying about capturing ground. There's an old strategic thought which is only infantry can ever capture and hold ground. It's something that's still used today, and it's true to an extent. But if you think of their weapons at the time, primarily a cavalryman is still using a sword, which is only just being reinvented in 1796, and we're going to come on to that. But actually, apart from redesigning a new sword, a curved sword has not changed that much in 800 years. I'm thinking of, since the first knights started to have them curved, especially coming in the Middle East, some superior horsemanship in a way, curved swords, and then versus straight swords. So it hasn't changed a lot. However, most of the cavalry do actually have secondary weapons, and it brings them onto the line. They'll either have a pair of service pistols, which are quite a hefty, almost like a sea service pistol. They're quite bulky, or and/or a carbine, which is effectively a musket at short range. Some of them have got clever features where the ramrod stays attached with a little device at the end, so you can't really drop your ramrod. And it's going to have reduced range and reduced accuracy. But at this time, the effective range of a musket is normally quoted at about 80 yards, which is about 60 meters. So reducing that down to 40 seems like a lot, but actually most armies are firing within that anyway. And you've got the ability that you can actually move up, fire, and then retreat. It's literally where dragoons came from, as they were meant to be mounted infantry. And that's something you'd see like in your Civil War. By this point, less and less. The French do this, especially out on campaigns.
More out of necessity, though, isn't it? It's more out of necessity. If they don't have,
because of the rough ground.
Yeah, or if they don't have enough horses to mount them.
Guerrillas and skirmish troops, but less so in battle. But they've got these weapons, and if people are formed in square, you know, I'm really thinking back to Waterloo, they will be riding up at almost at a meter's range, you know, placing a pistol towards someone's face and pulling the trigger.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good lead into just a brief thing about the traditions of the British cavalry and where the names come from. I'll just come off the ball by saying that a dragoon is a kind of is specifically quite a British thing. Every regiment had dragoons, but you know, almost all the British cavalry were actually dragoons at one point. And a dragoon. I'm going to let Marcus do the specific bits a little bit more, because you started at the beginning. But a dragoon in the English Civil War, which is where the term arises from, and people argue about what it means. Some people say it's like derived from Spanish or French for dragon, which is something to do with the musket. But basically, you get a foot soldier, you put him on a horse. He rides to where he's meant to be. He dismounts and he fights as an infantryman again, and that is the definition of a dragoon in the English Civil War. It became much more of a formalized kind of dashing do workhorses of the army kind of thing in European armies during the 16th and 17th centuries, and in the British Army, you get. It evolves. The old dragoons become essentially the heavy dragoons, and then you have light dragoons, and from there.
So the light dragoons come into like the scouting elements, and then the heavy dragoons become actually more dragoon guards, often because they've got seniority in their regiments. So much like the infantry, who start getting numbered from the first up to just over 100. The cavalry don't go so far, but they do get there's designations. So sometimes the lower the number, the more senior they are. No, something like golf.
Yeah.
And these lower numbers means that they get more access, especially during the Williamite era, William and Mary, and then it follows on, especially in the early Georgian. They get more access to the monarchs, and they start to become like dragoon guards, and they get these new designations, and they often get fancier uniforms and areas like that. Behind the scenes, with the British officers, they actually then start to become more expensive to purchase into. So there's still the purchasing system, and it could cost you twice as much to purchase into a dragoon guard regiment as it would a line infantry regiment, for example. So it started to become something of the real elite to be able to get into these regiments.
Quite so. The cavalry has always been more expensive than the infantry, because back in the day, you often would have to pay for your own horse or bring your own horse. Certainly in some regiments, so in the English Civil War and things like that. And when the army became into its sort of first incarnation, obviously, very rich colonels would want to be colonels of cavalry because outfitting such a body of men is extremely expensive. So,
and the colonels were paying this almost out of their own pocket, and then would claim a certain amount back. Mm-hmm. Which actually brings us on to one of the big advances, is that they're claiming it back. So some of the colonels would be wanting to make a profit, and some would be wanting to equip them really well. And those who are making a profit were buying items that were of inferior standard, belts that would fall apart, but most importantly, swords that would break. So they were given like a rough pattern to follow, but they're buying it on the cheap, worse quality metal, worse craftsmanship. This has been witnessed when Britain is on campaign in the Low Countries, the Spanish Low Countries they were, now the Netherlands, modern day Netherlands, and their swords are breaking. And I think he was then a major, Major Le Marchand witnesses this, and he designs two new swords, a heavy cavalry sword and a light cavalry sword. These are then adopted by Horse Guards, the British headquarters, and two new designs come out. The 1796 heavy cavalry sword, which is famously used in Sharp, and then a 1796 light cavalry sword, which we come on to. My version. This is a replica. I've got two replicas, and you can see we've got a thickened edge, so not quite a falcon, along with a strengthening tang. It's not for bloodletting, it's for strength, all the way up to the hilt. So we've got a gentle curve to this. Will go so deep into the flesh that the French actually asked for it to be banned. It was so that extra weight did so much damage. But then became a very strong, very sturdy sword. There's no bend in that whatsoever, and was very, very good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the demonstration. Nice from your gallery of weaponry. Which is up in your turret, and yeah, that's the one of the most impressive swords of the Napoleonic Wars, carried by the light dragoons and the hussar regiments of the British Cavalry, light cavalry, we should say. And for anybody who's also interested, the guard is known as a stirrup hilt because it resembles a stirrup. It's a fairly open guard, obviously, and some people say that's a disadvantage, especially if you put it against a French cavalry saber like the one on your left, to the left of that sword, which is a French heavy cavalry or dragoon saber. Which has a tri-bar, which offers much more protection to the hand if you're going to do a bit of fencing.
We'll do a whole thing on the swords, I think, but just a quick comparison there on the channel.
Like we said, it's interesting to think about that the cavalry were actually still kind of, their job was to get in close and fight hand to hand with their horses, and of course, as you said, they also had pistols and carbines, I should say, depending which they would use for outpost duty. And just another quick word on the designations of the cavalry. As you're saying, they don't mean a lot anymore. They're much like the names, like a dragoon. It's kind of a traditional thing. You know, a heavy cavalryman for some time now has always been able to do, I should say, actually, the job of a light cavalryman, and vice versa. Nowadays, it doesn't actually matter, except that the army, for organizational purposes, will usually still use light cavalry to do outpost work if they can, and retain heavy cavalry for the battlefield. Technically, that's kind of what they'll try to do, but it's not exclusively necessary to take.
It's starting to break down quite a lot by this point because of requirement of how many cavalry are needed. I was seeing a source the other day, and it had, for this era, roughly, the British population is about 14 million, whereas the French population is pushing on towards 30 million. So, you know, our nearest opponent have got twice as much population to call upon. I think the population of the British Isles now is pushing towards 80 million, so it's a big difference.
Absolutely. And so, with that in mind, how do you use cavalry? What's the best way to use it? And yes, I suppose we'll focus on the Peninsular War for some examples on that, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
I think one of the ones that goes as a small scale one, Sahagun.
Ah, right, yes.
Sahagun, like Uxbridge's little master strike, and that's the Earl of Uxbridge as he was there, Henry. And it's a very small fight during the retreat to Corunna under Sir John Moore. And it's basically he manages to get 2 squadrons of cavalry and kind of flank the French of a superior size. And it's basically about catching them when they're stationary.
Yes.
Enemy cavalry stationary and in the flank.
Right. Yes, this is good because this can give us some cavalry dynamics here. At the Battle of Sahagun, Paget, as he was then, led a charge out of a snowstorm into a bunch of bemused Frenchmen, having got a superior position on them. And you'll read this time and time again of the great cavalry commanders of the previous age, any age actually, where cavalry are still dominant. You must charge first. Otherwise, you will undoubtedly be overthrown by whatever is charging at you. And this happened at Sahagun. Paget led his hussars into the French cavalry and scattered him to the four winds. And
yes,
it's a very celebrated charge. And it shows what good handling of a regiment of cavalry can do against cavalry. And in a cavalry encounter, you must get the initiative. Otherwise, you will lose.
Good example, because normally the British are outnumbered. They are at Sahagun. It's a small scale. They call it a battle. It's more,
it's action.
It's an action at Sahagun. But it's outstanding managing to use the tactics and just very good horsemanship. Something which normally the French come off, at least on par, sometimes better. So it's really, really good.
The French cavalry are the finest cavalry in Europe. It's said by everybody. And that is because they have a kind of an innate understanding, an innate élan, if you will, but tempered by great professionalism. And that means that they understand the key precepts of cavalry warfare. That is, keeping the charge until the last possible minute. You were talking about musketry is an 80-foot killing range, probably 80-yard killing range, probably more like 50 if you want to actually be effective. Cavalry is roughly the same. You do not go into the gallop until you're about 50 to 80 yards away from whatever you're charging at. So you keep the compact mass together, because when horses gallop, they spread out. So that's number one.
It's about delivering effective, kinetic energy onto the enemy.
Exactly. And the second is the understanding that once you have made contact with the enemy, no matter if you kept that charge to the very last instant and you've been able to rally, you have stopped. Ideally, you want to stop once you have broken what is in front of you. For heaven's sake, most cavalry officers would say, do not pursue what is running, because you can break him again. And you do this by calling to the dudes you hopefully have behind you. 2 or 3, about 2 regiments width behind you, you're supposed to have another regiment or troop of cavalry coming up behind you at a nice orderly pace, slower than you're going. So once you've broken what's in front of you, they are available to do a leapfrog and take on whatever is behind the guys you just broke.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking of Salamanca, which is one of the best Allied cavalry charges. They get through 2 corps of French, but then they pursue on. And rather than holding and breaking, they pursue the French who are fleeing into kind of the wooded area to the rear, which is why there were 2 eagles captured at Salamanca, but both by infantry, not by cavalry, who were decimating French. They were causing some of the biggest casualties of the day. And they don't capture any eagles, which is obviously symbolic more than anything, but they should have caught some, because they're in the middle of French headquarters, but they kind of see beyond that and they don't really follow the protocol, and they charge off. The other one I'm thinking of with your formation, which is a really good point, is I believe Talavera, when two regiments of light dragoons, I think one of light dragoons, one of hussars actually, they charge so rapidly that the length of the flank is they get caught in a dry riverbed, and they lose so many horses, broken legs and injuries like that. And obviously for horses, that means they can't heal. That the regiment's pretty much sent home because they kind of just continue a canter or a charge to most of the length, and they just don't have the discipline, and they don't see this riverbed until they're upon it, and then there's piling into the back of them, which is quite tragic.
It is very tragic. It is. We'll get to mentioning the cost of horseborne warfare at the end of the video, but that brings up in my mind as well two things. First of all, the way cavalry charge works and what is a charge, and some of Wellington's criticisms of his cavalry. So first of all, a cavalry charge ideally is meant to work in a very ordered way, as I just said, and you have to take note of the gaits of the horse, the speeds of the horse, the motions of the horse. You start out at a walk, and you're actually supposed to maintain that walk for a fair distance before progressing to the trot, and these are all bugle calls, trumpet calls, walk march, trot march, and I think there might have been, but it goes through all the gaits of the horse. There's trot, walk, trot, canter, gallop, and that is the progression of a charge, classically speaking.
Which is often just kind of shown as they just kind of moving at the speed and then they're going at the full charge. But like you say, they are progressing up, almost like a car going up through the gears.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the next time you see a movie where you see cavalry regiment and they just go hell for leather, either a really bad cavalry commander or just wrong. Someone who doesn't understand that also you need your horses to be fit. And
I was thinking that the horses would be blown, as they say. They're out of breath by the time they're almost reaching. You want that maximum impact, because the horse is part of the weapon, literally knocking people over, this kinetic energy, the horse flesh hitting people, causing damage.
Yep, and that also brings on some of the interesting, ties into the interesting criticisms Wellington had of his cavalry, most famously that our cavalry have gotten into the trick of galloping at everything and then galloping back just as fast. He went on to complain that they never think of position or reserves, as we were just talking about. Now, Wellington wasn't exactly a cavalryman. He was an excellent horseman, but he didn't serve with the cavalry, although in India he had actually he had led a cavalry charge or two.
Briefly hold a commission in the cavalry, but I don't even think he turned up to the regiment. In his very early career, there was a system of purchases, and he moved up through those, and he was mostly on administrative duties in Ireland at this point, and so he changed. So I think he was less than a year. I think actually he moved regiments 2 or 3 times in a year. He was in a cavalry commission. So, but without having served with them, we can't ever call Wellington a cavalry man. He was always serving with the infantry.
No, as a battalion officer, he was definitely with the infantry. But as a general, he did understand the use of them, and actually he wrote some very detailed instructions. I think around 1813 or something like that, about how cavalry were to be used, and he strictly emphasized that you must have at least 2 lines of reserves, because he knew that the British cavalry had this habit of really wanting to pursue things once they've broken them and just keep on charging. It's the impulse that the hunter gets on his horse as he sees a fleeing enemy. Is the godlike power.
He's galloping back. You can remind me of Napoleon's famous epitaph about British cavalry as well.
The terrible grey horses, or?
Oh well, I was thinking the world's greatest cavalry, but the world's
in the movie. I don't know whether he actually said that or not.
I don't know either, but it's
it's a fun bit in the movie where
it kind of summarizes what almost like Wellington was saying.
It brilliantly summarizes the thing with the British cavalry. Rod Steiger is looking at the Scots Greys attacking, and he says those men on grey horses are terrifying. And one of his staff officers goes, "They're the noblest cavalry in Europe, but the worst led." And that is the case. The British were famous for the quality of horses and the bravery of their soldiers. But although the French were very irritated by the fact they could very rarely actually defeat them because the British cavalry were very audacious and loved to attack anything they saw, they did realize that you could quite simply rebuff them because they would just not stop. And I'm thinking of the Battle of Campo Mayor, which I think was in 1811, and one brigade of light cavalry just kept charging. They overthrew regiment after regiment after regiment, and they just got so completely out of control that they were utterly overthrown and defeated by some fresh regiments of French cavalry. This happened at Vimiero as well, with Colonel Taylor's charge, overthrowing many regiments on his way to the French lines, practically, until.
It's kind of, to be unfair, but it's kind of what happened to the British heavy cavalry at Waterloo as well.
It is exactly what happened to the British cavalry at Waterloo.
They'd actually gone through so many French, they actually had no more French left, and then saw the gun positions on the slight slope above them and kept going. Mm-hmm. They'd ridden through all the infantry, and then where they should have stopped and wheeled around, they then carry on. Mm-hmm. Which gives you that wonderful scene in the Waterloo film of the Scots Greys going in slow motion, and then the Lancers coming in and decimating them in return.
The Lancers and the Cuirassiers came in and did what the French cavalry do, which is give a very short, sharp, disciplined charge, turn around, and reform. Yeah. French cavalry knew what they were doing. The British cavalry knew how to put on a show. And that
still do today, I'll argue. In London, we see it still happens.
Oh yes.
To help people visualise it. The only difference really between then and now in 200 years, okay, lots has changed, but they didn't wear the breastplates. But otherwise, very similar to the British cavalry.
That is a criticism of the British cavalry. There is truth to it. Wellington was particularly harsh with his cavalry. Ian Fletcher, for instance, has written a book, I think, called Galloping at Everything, in which he tries to kind of prove, I think he does it effectively, that the British cavalry weren't just the nutcases that they're supposed to, that they're of legend. But
it's a wide sweeping generalization, but there is a lot of truth to it, and I think that's kind of they're the positives and the negatives, that they'll deliver that charge, but they won't stop. So
it was often said that one British regiment could take on and win against two French, but it usually didn't signify much because they would usually lose the fight in the long run.
And on the flip side, if I may, changing it round, what I find fascinating about the cavalry, and I mentioned it earlier, is the unwritten bits that aren't in any actions, that they're so busy when an infantry regiment is in camp. Yes, they'll be sending out picket duty sentries, but the cavalry are going on these reconnaissance patrols. They are going over the hills and trying to find and locate. This is not being done by Sharp's green jackets. It's not what the infantry are being used for. They're doing very short distance patrols and guarding. The cavalry, which Wellington has to admit, I think I've seen in one of his dispatches, or he almost says, I don't really know the difference between heavy cavalry and light cavalry. They're both on horses, and let's use them. And he's actually a short man. He needs more of everything, and especially horses and artillery. But he kind of sends them off, and it's not glamorous work. And there's some beautiful paintings, especially by Lady Butler, but there's some others too. Thinking of cavalry going over these hills or sneaking through, brush and trees, and it's a really, really important job. As much today as it was then, as it would have been with scouts going back before there was even a standing army in Britain. You would have been having men go out and do scouting. And if you're on a horse, you are more mobile. Not only can you find the enemy quicker, but also you can escape. The whole idea is not to find them and then go in all guns blazing and attack them. It's to find them and hopefully actually get away without them having seen you. Exactly. Peering over things.
Exactly. They're going to be finding whether this road actually goes that way. Is there a bridge over this river? If not, how deep is the river? Such things like that are the common currency of advanced work in an army, and it's like part of the goal of the cavalry is to screen the army so that the enemy can't see it, but that you can see the enemy. If you can penetrate the enemy's cavalry screen, then you can get information. You can get prisoners.
It's what is referred to. Screening is basically called reconnaissance in force. So you're going out with a larger force than the enemy. So when they try to reconnaissance against you, you can actually fight them off. And that screen means that they don't see what's behind that shield, which is nearly always going to be cavalry in this era. Mm-hmm. Today it's like light tanks and light Land Rovers, things like that, and armored Land Rovers. But back then it was cavalry, whether heavy or light, they were doing it, and they did it very well. And
it was their job.
It was a lonely task. I was reading in preparation for a talk I gave, and reading. This was often one young subaltern, which is a cornet, a second lieutenant, or a lieutenant, out probably with 2 NCOs and 12 to 20 troopers, which are the junior ranks, private soldiers or corporals. And that's all they've got, and they're going out either on a patrol or a picket, and they will come across a French force that's similar, maybe more, maybe less. They probably won't know initially, and they're doing this at night time as well, which is much more unusual.
Yeah, that's outpost work. That's light cavalry. Well, that's just outpost work. That's just cavalry work. And as the author Alan Mallinson said, the work of cavalry goes largely unobserved, because most of it, about 80% of it, happens off the battlefield. And even on the battlefield, it's misunderstood because, like I was saying before, a charge can mean just a very orderly advance which overthrows the enemy. It can happen at a canter or a trot. It doesn't have to have a gallop. Duke of Marlborough,
steady, yes.
The Duke of Marlborough, for instance, had his cavalry deliver their attacks at the trot, because that way you maintain the formation forwards, and whoever has the best formation and in contact will generally win, so long as you attack first. Is the rule. And yeah, nobody did that in Napoleonic Wars anymore because they wanted to be a bit faster. But that's the idea. That is a kind of a brief rundown of Wellington's cavalry, explaining a little about his thought processes, why he was so critical of it, and why he had in great measure, cause to be happy with it. Certainly if he had trusted commanders like Marchant or Paget or Uxbridge, or Stapleton Cotton, or any of the Alton and von Bock and people like that. And we haven't been able to talk about everything, for instance, but maybe we should round off by giving a little thoughtful nod to the animals themselves. As you mentioned before in the recording, that if you walk up the edge of Hyde Park, on your right you will eventually come to a very, I don't know how to describe it. It's a very nice memorial.
It's modern but simple, but yes, it needed to be there. Mm-hmm. It's nice that it's Hyde Park. Hyde Park's still designated as one of the areas for the cavalry to train today. It's not far from Knightsbridge Barracks, where the Household Cavalry are. And every year there is a memorial service to the animals. And I think they come from the Household Cavalry and King's Troop, and also the Working Dogs Regiment. Little nod to them. And I think in recent years, normally Ginny Cooper, the author, because she's got a real equestrian theme, often reads some verses. And you do see often one of the veterinary officers and a few riding back. It's quite nice. Obviously, our four-legged friends we depend upon, but they were pretty much Britain's only conscripts in the army at that time.
As the memorial says.
And huge casualty figures. I was reading the opening passage about the code breaking in the peninsula, and it starts with the retreat from Corunna, and there wasn't room on these ships to take the horses, and the fact that the cavalry had to then destroy their horses, and it's talking about the soldiers with the tears streaming down their eyes, having to, you know, dispatch their own animals. I found that deeply moving, and I can really picture it. It was very well written. But,
yeah, it's absolutely the case. You can read.
I didn't want to do. But,
I mean, you can read gruesome tales of battle of men being wounded and things like that, but it makes me sound like a psychopath. But reading about the Battle of Waterloo, when I read about the aftermath of Waterloo, when because I'm apparently a masochist as well, I decided to try and find out what happened to the horses. It's soul destroying.
It's terrible.
It's even the people themselves at the time said that it was some of the worst things they'd ever seen to deal with.
Cavalier Mercer's memoirs, he talks about something.
Yes, absolutely. And if you, this is yesterday, Jacqueline Wright posted a tremendously sad story about an officer at the Battle of Salamanca, where his poor bay horse got both its eyes shot out and was hit 6 times in the body and still carried him an hour before it finally died. And so, yes, as the memorial on Hyde Park, at the edge of Hyde Park says, they had no choice and they didn't know why they were suffering when they got hit. You know, you walk up a battalion and you ask a man why he's there, he'll give you a reason. You ask a horse, someone pulled me out and trained me. And
so yeah, depressing as it is, it's worthy of note. But you know, the cavalry were, if not the backbone, they were the eyes, the ears, and the fast feet of the army, and needed them for victory, certainly.
Mm-hmm. And that's why it's very important still to consider the cavalry and to keep that in mind when we read about the cavalry. They're incredibly important, couldn't have happened without the horses, and thank goodness horses in war and animals in war is a much rarer thing today.
Thank goodness indeed. Yeah, up here. Hopefully people enjoy like us doing a shorter thing specifying one bit of the army.
Yep.
I think we're going to go on to artillery next.
Yeah,
we might come on to specialist infantry, and we were been chatting about doing maybe like lesser known, like we were talking about maybe foreign regiments in Wellington's army, which are much like some of them, like I've always got a bit of a thing for the Chasseurs Britanniques. Mm-hmm. You see them on paper in books, and then they're like never mentioned, and they're like Wikipedia pages really small, and this and that. And there's like only one real book written about them, and so we might come on to some like lesser known bits and try to get some interest going. But if people want to let us know, they can comment, and obviously Twitter.
What's your favorite? What's your favorite? We'll see what we can do. But for now, from both of us, from the Tower and from the Castle of Madness, we offer you our best wishes. Have courage and compassion, and we'll see you the next time. Bye.